Well, hey everybody, welcome back to Two Guys, a Girl, and F1. This is my race notes for the Las Vegas Grand Prix. Not a lot to say about the race itself. It was pretty much decided in the first corner, but I will say that I thought qualifying was one of the most entertaining qualifying sessions of the year because it rained in Las Vegas. It rained in the desert. Who would have thought? They've been having rain in Las Vegas now for a couple of weeks. Highly unusual, of course, because Las Vegas is in the middle of the desert. But I thought it was really a very interesting qualifying session. You know, they were talking about the track being low grip. They went through free practice 1, 2, and 3. They had some damp conditions, but not like streaming wet, which combined with the cold air, the temperature of the track, I believe, was 10 degrees Celsius cooler this year than it was last year. Because my guess is, and this is my running theory, nobody said anything about it, but there was, cloud cover throughout the day, which means that the sun was not out, baking the asphalt and driving the temperature of the asphalt up. So you had a cold track. The track's pretty smooth, but they opened the track up to traffic because, it's going down the strip. And so you've got to have that traffic going back and forth when the race cars aren't on the track. And so, a lot of grit is brought in. There's probably some cars dropping oil and that kind of stuff. So the track never really fully rubbers in like it would if it was a regular circuit. And so you combine that with the cold temperatures and at least dampness, and the track was quite slick for most of the sessions. Everybody was talking about how low grip the track was, and yet they were having to run a compromise solution because with that long straightaway, they're basically running a Monza setup, in that it's a very low drag, low downforce configuration because that straightaway going down the strip is like a mile long, and they've got to trim the car out and get as much drag out of the car as possible. Well, as we've discussed before, downforce causes drag. And so if you go and you peel downforce out of the car, in this case, drag, guess what? They both, dial out the drag, you're going to dial out the downforce. So the cars were slipping and sliding all over the place. It was pretty spectacular to watch. And then we got to qualifying, and here came the rain. And it was absolutely so much fun to watch. And of course, I was kind of excited by the proposition that, hey, the track was wet. The great equalizer is always rain. And shoot, man, my boy Fernando Alonso was up there at the top of the speed charts, and it was so interesting because all those guys would go out at the very beginning and they would take 2 or 3 laps to get any kind of heat in the tires, and then you'd see their lap times just come tumbling down. And a lot of that, it wasn't so much, I think, from track evolution because the rain was just washing everything away. It was the fact that they finally got the tires up in kind of the operating window and they could go faster. But even then, I think, like free practice 1, they were like 15 seconds off the pace of what they were doing in a dry session there in Vegas. They were like, instead of a 135, they were at like 150 or maybe 155, which would be 20 seconds off the pace. So anyway, the track was a whole lot slower, and yet it was just clearly diabolical. A lot of fun to watch. At the end of the day, Lando Norris in Q3 popped in a really great lap. Max was right there, and good for him. Carlos Sainz was third quick. Really happy to see that. Of course, we all know the Williams is going to be fast in a straight line. And that showed up here, even in the wet. I can't imagine going 200 miles an hour in that kind of wet, but they were, and full credit to them. But, lots of drivers overcooking it into the corner, the left-hand corner after the long straightaway. There was a lot of action down there in the runoff area because guys would leave their braking too late for the conditions and they go right off the end of the circuit. So it was really good fun to watch. Really enjoyed it. As far as the race concerns, like I said, it was kind of a snoozer. No, it wasn't kind of a snoozer. It was a snoozer. And I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that, you had the colder than usual ambient temperatures, which then is translated to a track that just couldn't warm up. The cars couldn't get grip, that kind of thing. And so the race was pretty processional after the first turn. Lando made a good start and made a move and basically went to cover Max going into turn one. And he left his braking too late on cold tires, and he went way to the outside of the first turn, and Max slipped through, and then Russell slipped through, and that was pretty much the race. Kimi Antonelli drove an unbelievably good race, and of course he wound up finishing fourth on the track, which then became third after the disqualification of both of the McLarens on the plank. And so I guess that's really the big bit of news coming out of that weekend, of course, was the disqualification of both McLarens for having excessive wear on their rear skid block. And basically what that means is skid blocks have to be a certain thickness and at the end of the race. And the reason that they do that is to prevent the cars from running so low that, it would cause a problem. And the plank has been there forever in various guises. And this is not the first time a car's been disqualified this season. I think Lewis Hamilton had one disqualification. I think Hulkenberg was disqualified for the very same thing. And so it's not unusual to see it. However, it was really unusual to see it because, the two championship leading drivers had their cars suspended or disqualified for the very same reason, which was that plank having excessive wear. And, the rules are the rules. And so they're out. And what this does, of course, is now Max is tied for points on Oscar, and he's within firing range of Lando. Now, my understanding is, and I haven't looked at this real close, but my understanding is we have got, if Lando is going to clinch the World Driving Championship in Qatar this coming weekend, he's got to score 2 more points than Max does, and the championship is his. And if he doesn't do that, now we've got a championship showdown going on in Abu Dhabi, so the following weekend. So ought to be pretty interesting. Who would have thought that, in August that Max would be in contention to win the world championship? But it's very much that way. And honestly, if Max wins the world championship, it's kind of because McLaren choked. I'll just say it right out loud. I just kind of see it kind of being that way. They should never have made that mistake on the skid block. So anyway, that's neither here nor there now. I mean, that's water under the bridge. We move on to Qatar, and off we go for another race weekend, the middle of the final 3 races of the year. So it ought to be a very interesting event. And it'll be very much a race that has to do with the managing of tires. So stay tuned for that. I'm looking forward to it. It ought to be a lot of fun to watch, and on a very different track, although it is another track in the desert, but this time it's a permanent track. So that's going to make a big difference. So hope you enjoyed this. Would love to hear your comments, and we'll be talking to you in about a week.